Morning, Lauren. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. Good morning, Fitz. As usual, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
All right, so when you started climbing, I'm wondering if there was any climbers that you really looked up to. Like maybe not just mentors in your community, but like those big names in the sport, those legends that made you feel just like I can't believe that what they do is even possible.
It's so interesting, right? Because like in our sport, there are these legends. We put these people up 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 on the wall, and the thing about it is that uh, they really aren't that different than us. Like our space. I mean, sometimes yes, there are people that are gifted athletes, but a lot of like what happens in the outdoors comes from motivation. It comes from creativity. It comes from like willpower and enthusiasm and follow through. And so I think a lot of times like these legends in our sports, it's easy to sort of just be like, whoa, and sort of be in awe. But they're not that different. I remember there was this big traverse, this big mountain traverse, and for me, I really admired Pete Croft, who is this incredible climber who was both really good at free soloing, but also had this knack for kind of combining these big, long link ups of different mountains into these incredible traverses. And he had done one in Washington State, the Stewart Range Traverse, and I was probably just finishing college. I was like, I'd heard about this thing, I'd seen it, with my own eyes, and been like, wow. And I think I'd even thought, wouldn't it be cool if you did all that? And then I said that out loud. And someone's like, well, someone's done it, and it's Pete Croft. Except there's no information, and it was at a time when there was nothing online about that. And I was like, how do I do this? And at some point, someone just like gave me Pete Croft's number, and I was really nervous when I was like, oh my god, I'm calling a legend. And then it was like some guy just got on the phone. Was like, oh hey, that's really cool. You're thinking about trying that. I don't really remember that much about it, and just like, but you'll do great. Just bring a lot of food and water, And it's like he gave like the most basic tips ever, but he wasn't afraid. He was like psyched to talk to me.
Yeah, it's cool to think about someone like that because, there's this old trope in climbing about how lucky we are, right, to play on the same terrain as our heroes. And I feel like climbers are often saying, you don't go to shoot hoops at your neighborhood like basketball court one day and run into Michael Jordan, but you might say go climbing in Indian Creek and run into Steph Davis, or you might be climbing in Yosemite or in the Owens River Gorge in Bishop, where I live, and run into Peter Croft on like a daily basis. And it's a pretty cool thing within our sport.
Yeah, and it's also, it's funny because our sport also relies so much on mentorship. Not that other sports don't, but like in particular, like there's something, there's no coaches for the most part in outdoor climbing or in like these sort of adventure sports that are done kind of in the wilds. So we really need mentorship.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think a lot of that mentorship is about looking up to the, previous generation, to the climbers that did things that we aspired to do one day. Um, and speaking of that previous generation, Fitz, what do you know about Jim Donini?
Well, he is a freaking legend. He is one of the most prolific alpinists in American history. And we interviewed him recently or in the last year on Climbing Gold, or other podcast, about one of his most famous climbs, which actually he didn't even finish, but it was so legendary and it was such an experience that it sort of got this mythic nature in climbing. There are few climbers that have had his kind of career. And part of it is that he was really good. And part of it was that he is eternally motivated in a way that few people really are.
Yeah, and so if you wanted to rope up with Jim Donini, like what do you think that would actually take? Or like better yet, what do you think it would take to get him to mentor you in something like the art of the first descent?
I would imagine that you need to have the same level of energy and enthusiasm and love for the sport. You'd have to have some decent level of talent, right? And I feel like you need a little bit of a resume or a little bit of a reputation. I mean, I don't think you could just call him up and ask him to go climbing. Could you?
Well, that is exactly what we're about to find out. Today, we present Meet Your Heroes, a story about Jim Donini, Tad McCrea, and an unlikely intergenerational friendship that takes root during an epic trip to Patagonia. I'm Lauren Delane Miller.
And I'm Fitz Call. You're listening to the Dirtbag Diaries.
Tad's a pretty special guy. You know, his nickname is Too Big to Fail. And, you know, he was a college athlete. But more than anything, what it is about Tad that makes him special, as far as I'm concerned, is his attitude. I've never seen him not smiling. He's just a force of nature. I mean, he's 42 years younger. I guess I got to the age where I needed somebody that young to be able to be successful anymore. I can't climb as hard as I used to, that's for sure, but I can still climb fairly well. I remember when I was 10 years old, I heard that Hillary and Tenzing had climbed Everest, and I thought, damn, I want to do that. Even though grew up in Philadelphia, where back in those days, nobody knew anything about climbing. My father was a history professor at a college, and he'd never traveled much, but he got me into reading books about exploration. And I got to this point where I thought, you know, I was born too late, it's all been explored. And then I got into climbing, I found out that wasn't the case. There were mountains that had never been climbed. Even on a mountain that had been climbed, there were routes on the mountain that never been climbed. So for me, climbing to a large extent is fulfilling my exploratory urge. You know, I might be sleeping on a ledge on a peak, and no one's ever been there before. Nobody's ever slept there. Sticking my hand into a crack, and no one has ever put their hand in that crack. I'm someplace where no one has ever been before.
So that feeling, that thirst to experience the nooks and crannies of the world are what connects climbers to deep sea explorers, to astronauts, those looking to the folds of our planet where sustained human existence is impossible. Even inside the circle of dedicated climbers, there's a small inner ring of people who are intrigued by the lure of first descents in the big ranges. It's dangerous, it's uncomfortable, it's time-consuming, and often results with what on paper looks like a total abject failure. The few that succeed typically sustain a decade, maybe two, before they move on. Jim has been at it for 60 years. Tad, slightly less so.
Since I can ever remember, I've always had a passion for adventure and the outdoors. I was a rower at the University of Washington, so was in and around a good mountain community, but didn't really have the time to experience that. And when I finished my eligibility, I kind of transferred all my energies into, mountaineering.
Like many new climbers, Tad's dreams were fueled by the stories of these larger-than-life alpinists that had come before him. And pretty quickly, he realized that he gravitated toward climbers with a certain ethos.
Trying to be light, or trying to be self-supported, or going places no one had ever been, or not just going somewhere that no one had ever been, but doing it in some really adventurous style.
At that time, the gap between the ascents that inspired Tad and the skills he possessed was large. That cannot be overstated. And that is both the awesome part about being young and possessing big ambitions, and it also makes, it puts some risks into the whole equation. You need mentorship, but you lack the skills, and you've got to make up for it with enthusiasm.
Right, so it's 2004. Tad has just graduated from the University of Washington. He's gotten pretty good at running up non-technical peaks like Mount Rainier, but he doesn't yet possess the technical skills on ice and on rock that his dreams require. So he comes up with a plan.
I love this part of the story.
Okay, so Tad decides that he's going to reach out to legendary alpinist Steve House. Steve had just recovered from a nearly life-ending accident in the Canadian Rockies, and he was looking for a little more stability by establishing a guiding business. And so Tad's plan was to write to him and offer his hard work in exchange for experience. It's a classic unpaid internship, right? If Steve never wrote back, Tad would just pretend that this whole thing never happened. But Steve did write back, and months later, Tad was in Ouray, Colorado, starting an internship on the eve of the Ouray Ice Climbing Festival.
Like, I arrived the first night of the Ice Fest that year. I don't know anything. And I'm just like, Steve's like, come to dinner with us. And it's like him and Roger Strong and Scott Backes and Barry Blanchard and Vince and Hayden.
Right, so Tad is surrounded by living legends, like all around him. Hayden Kennedy, right, is the rising star in the world of alpinism at that time.
At one point, everyone's like giving me like beta. I'm like taking mental notes. And then I remember that Hayden was like, if you're the most psyched climber, people will want to climb with you and you'll have partners and you do best what you do most. And if you have partners all the time, you'll be climbing all the time and you'll get good. I ended up like staying there for whatever, a week and a half or 2 weeks, like just basically right away learning that like, oh, like you don't actually, these people don't have to be, they may be legendary in terms of like the way we perceive them, but really they're just humans like everyone else. And yeah, through that, I ended up being really lucky to meet a lot of people, including Jim Donini.
Do you remember the first time you met Jim or when you came across his name?
The first time I can remember was getting a hold of a copy of 50 Favorite Climbs in North America. And he's in the book. Spoiler alert, Jim Donini's in the 50 Favorite Climbs book. And he had chosen the Cobra Pillar.
This book was this awesome coffee table book of 50 notable climbers picking their favorite routes. It's like a way better version of the famed 50 classic climbs in North America. It was written by Mark Cruz. It was like a perfect tick list for many of the aspiring climbers in the early 2000s.
Ted, will you read the entry?
Jim Donini, style matters. That's the first line, right? For the past 30 years, Jim Donini has been crisscrossing the globe in search of true adventure, and he's found plenty, with dozens of first ascents to his name, from Alaska to Patagonia to the Himalaya. Donini is a unique blend of traditional ethics and new age technical skills. A lot of my heroes are in this book, but like, you know, some people stand out more than others. So I wanted to have an adventure. The world's kind of getting a little less adventurous. It's hard not to, but if you combine new age technical skill with that, then there is still plenty of adventure.
In the 10 years after Tad's experience with Steve House in Colorado, his climbing, well, let's say it's come a long way. With proud ascents in the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, Alaska, and, of course, Patagonia.
Patagonia, the famed region of peaks, forests, and lakes that's drawn climbers and explorers for over 100 years. When Donini first visited the region in the 1970s, it required days, probably weeks of travel to get there. The town that now supports visitors didn't exist. It was a frontier of gauchos, small sheep ranches, and cattle operations, and a world of opportunities.
The mountains are spectacular. The climbing is as good as anywhere in the world. I did the first ascent of Torriega, which is one of the hardest peaks. It's a beautiful place, and it's unique. The wildlife is unique. Guanacos and rheas, ostriches. I don't know, it just gets into your blood. There's a bush called the calafate. It's berries, calafate berries, and they're edible. So my first trip there, I ate some calafate berries. And what they say is if you eat the calafate berry, you always come back.
Jim returned time and time again and eventually built a small house in Chile, where he could spend months each year exploring and wandering the peaks and valleys. Climbing in Patagonia has been a goal for generations of aspiring alpine climbers, and Tad McCrea was no different.
In 2014, Tad and a group of friends won a grant from the American Alpine Club to climb in the Torres del Paine, a national park in Chilean Patagonia, famed for its massive granite spires. They were hoping to establish a new route on the east face of Cerro Catedral. They needed to be fit and psyched, so that fall, before their trip, they gathered in the Utah desert in a place called Indian Creek to train.
And Jim happened to be there. And so we stopped by his campsite. We talked to him for a couple hours. And by the end of it, he was like really psyched, and he'd like invited us to his place and like had all this beta for us, basically offering all this like support. And he didn't even, know us at that point, really. That's when I feel like the relationship really was initiated.
That winter, Tad and the crew headed south. It was February of 2015, and psych was high. Their first stop was at Jim and his wife Angela's house, where Jim pointed them in the direction of a nearby peak called Cerro Colorado. With help from Jim, the team established a few new routes. And while their trip to Torres del Paine didn't go as planned, Tad came away from that trip with a new friendship and a plan to return.
I got to know Jim a lot better, enough to the point where, he'd mentioned a couple of objectives that he wanted to do in and around his place. And I really was keen on getting out and climbing up there too. And so I just kind of kept in touch with him. And the next season, we planned for me to come up and do some climbing. Try to climb some supposedly unclimbed peaks in hard to get to areas. So utilizing pack rafting to cross lakes or navigate down rivers to get in, out, or around hard to navigate, like kind of jungly forests.
Tad went back to Patagonia the next year in early 2016 to attempt some new routes with Jim. The climbing around Jim's place, let's say it's kind of an acquired taste.
It's a much more complex situation. It involves going through temperate rainforests, crossing glaciers. And usually when you're doing that, you're in a place where very few people have ever been, maybe nobody. A lot of the climbing in the area where we are, if you're close to the ocean, the further west you go, the more moisture you have. And you could be in a deep valley and you have to start climbing up through a rainforest. So sometimes the hardest part of the climb is just getting through the rainforest.
As Jim aged, many of his partners' enthusiasm for miles-long bushwhacking, crumbling rock, and really cold river crossings, it waned. Tad was the injection of energy that Jim needed.
Tad reminds me of me 40 years ago. I think that's one of the things that attracted me to him, because I've always been into the exploration part of climbing. So I never had problems with the approach. And I've always felt that I'm going someplace where no one's ever been before. And okay, there's no trail, it's difficult, you have heavy packs, heavy loads, and a lot of climbers think, that's not much fun. But for me, it's exciting.
I went into it being like, yeah, like you're going to go climbing with Jim Donini, dude. And like, you're going to learn so much. To me, he's an absolute legend. And I was like, I'm going to get to see like how he turns a vision or like a dream or like an objective into reality. And like, wow, like I'm going to learn so much. So Jim picks me up in Chile Chico. He's just all psyched. Like, I got this idea, like we got to check out Google Earth when we get home. It's out of Lago Leones, and there's a couple lakes we have to cross, but it's this great like lake cirque with this huge exposure and terrain. And it sounded like super awesome and romantic and inspiring. And he's like, yeah, so maybe we leave tomorrow. And I just got off like a however long bus ride, and I've been climbing. I just climbed Fitzroy like the week before in El Chalten, and I'm pretty psyched to like repack and like maybe like get organized again. And take a day, and I'm kind of trying to find ways to relate this to him without sounding soft. Once we got back and we're talking with Angela, I could kind of run it off Angela too, because she's like, that sounds crazy. Kind of like, you guys are going to go tomorrow? Like, we're not packed at all. We've never climbed together, and I don't even know where we're going really yet, right? And so eventually we look at the map, and I'm like, I don't know. I think maybe if we wait a day, it might help us out a little. And Jim just turns to me and he says, like, in the classic Jim style, he's like, yeah, I guess you're right. No sense in heading off half-cocked. And I was like, oh shit, like this is gonna be a good trip.
The plan is simple. They'll cross an estancia, eventually reach a lake, where they will pack raft across the lake and then ascend a glacier to establish a new route on a tower they'd seen from the highway.
And then we took off in the Hilux the next morning, and just like Jim drives kind of like he hikes, like we're running out of time, basically. And so we're just like ripping down the highway in a cloud of dust.
They park the truck and head out on a faint trail toward the lake. Their packs are huge, full of camping gear and food for a few days, climbing gear, crampons, ice axes, everything they'd need to pack raft too. I mean, it's a pretty heavy load.
I remember like getting out there and we're powering into the objective, like straight up. That's what I mean. He's not even close to slow. I already knew he was fast. Like I knew he was fast. He knows he's fast and he kind of leans on that over a lot of his other past strengths, let's say, because like he is pretty good at it actually. He's pretty quick. He's the fastest 80-year-old I know. So we're like moving pretty quick and I'm like, yeah, like I'm gonna learn a ton. And I remember we get to like the lake and it just starts unraveling and we don't really know how good the rock is. Like, you know, looking back now, I'm like, oh, it should look kind of brown and red on Google Earth. Like, we kind of knew what we could have expected, but I don't know. I'm with Jim Donini, and like, this guy knows everything to me.
As they inflate the pack rafts, the biting horseflies called tabanos, they are raining terror on them.
Jim's like killing tabanos, like horseflies at the lake. I swear he was eating them, but maybe not. I've since been told by him he doesn't think he ate it.
They launch and start paddling into a building wind. Waves up to 3 feet high are hitting the shore.
Jim and I end up in this huge, once again, like headwind. Almost can't cross this lake that's super narrow. And I started being like, oh shit, like we should have brought PFDs. Like what was I thinking? And so we were like super exposed. And I start realizing, you know, wow, like each leg of this journey ends up being a little bit gnarlier than we expected.
They make it safely across the lake, and they finally lay eyes on their objective, which has been around a corner out of view this whole time.
And it just looks like a pile of shit. And we worked really hard to get in there. And I remember getting kind of nervous because I was ahead of Jim and I was like, fuck, like this looks bad. I don't really want to do it. And I don't know how to bring this up to Jim that we shouldn't climb this thing, like, because I don't want to sound soft again. And, you know, he paddles up to me and he looks at the peak and looks at me and he's like, well, that thing looks pretty shitty, huh? And like instantly I was like, the ice is broken. And it was that evening as we kind of decided to bail and paddle back the next morning. We're just camping on this little like silted like beach basically at the bottom of this glacier. And where we just like chatted and rapped for like 4 or 5 hours and like all of a sudden like got to actually know each other. Whereas I'd already felt like I knew Jim and I already started to feel comfortable, but all of a sudden I was like, no, like this guy's my bro.
They go back to the drawing board, and the next day while Jim rests, Tad and Angela head out in the Hilux to get some inspiration and try to figure out how to access a supposedly unclimbed peak called Cerro Chueco.
We had, you know, like some maps and some binoculars, and we were trying to find access to this one peak that's called Cerro Chueco. And we kind of like, we're like, well, you could go this way, but it looks kind of hard. Like we just looked on the map and we're like, that road gets you a lot closer. We'll go there. And so a couple days later, Jim and I packed up.
Jim, Tad, and Angela get in the Hilux and drive towards Cerro Chueco. The plan is for Angela to drop them off at the road they've picked out on the map. But on their way there,
we come around like one of these corners again, driving on the road, and we just see this other peak. But Jim just immediately is like, what the fuck is that? Like, maybe we should go climb that instead. And I just like think to myself initially, I just remember being like, what the fuck? Like, now we're just going to change plans? Like, come on, now he's being such an old man. Like, we got to stick to our guns. But pretty soon I'm like looking at it and I am realizing it's quite cool. And it looks like we can get closer to that peak. And all right, yeah, sure. Like, let's go for it.
Tad is a bit baffled, but Jim has decades of experience in these mountains. So Tad defers to him. Cerro Puño it is.
And so we take off for an objective that we hadn't planned at all for.
after the break, Tad and Jim's enthusiasm is put to the test. We'll be right back. Support for the diaries comes from Kuat Racks. They've released the Ibex, an overlanding truck bed rack that handles substantial loads both on and off the grid, because we could all use some time off the grid, seriously. Constructed from lightweight yet durable aluminum, the black powder coat is made for all the nature you can throw at it. Available in different frame sizes to accommodate most truck models, the Ibex is engineered for adventure with versatile full and half-height configuration. It's an ecosystem of adventure possibilities. For more details, visit kuat.com. Kuat, because you will absolutely love this bed rack and go dope places. Do you have a resolution to adventure outdoors more this year? Make it happen with Sierra Club Outings. Leaders in conservation-focused, active outdoor adventures, Sierra Club Outings hosts over 250 small group trips every year where you can backpack, kayak, raft, volunteer, and more. These trips fill up fast, so reserve your spot at sierraclub.org/outings and use the code DIRTBAG to get $100 off. With Sierra Club Outings, it's more than just a trip. It's an adventure with a cause. We'll put a link in the show notes. Check out all the incredible trips they have and make that resolution happen.
Hey everyone, it is that time of year. We need your shorts, your stories, because you power this show. We hear from so many of you that one day you're going to submit your short and send it to us at the Diaries. Guess what? That moment, it could be right now. So make it a New Year's goal or use it as an excuse to take a break from Uncle Joe at the holidays. You make this community, your voice is valued. You can find all the information you need at our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. Click on the Write Us tab where you can find instructions and the submission form. Pay attention to it. It helps the cause. Trust me. Link is in the show notes, so take a moment, click on it, consider it, and then get to work. You've got until January 19th to send us your short. Once again, it's dirtbagdiaries.com/write us. Thanks.
Tad and Jim have just changed their plan on the fly. They're aiming for a big, beautiful wall that they're hoping is ripe with new root potential. On their way, they run into a friend of Jim's.
This like Polish pack rafting like icon.
And they take a photo of his map with Tad's camera. With a little bit of guidance, they head out towards the peak. The plan is to cache the pack rafts, go climb the peak, and then come back to their rafts and head down the river to a planned takeout spot where Angela could pick them up a few days later.
We just start bushwhacking up this like heinous, like jungly bamboo. But like, once again, Jim and I like are realizing that like we're two of the only people we know that really actually enjoy this kind of like bushwhacking. And he's like lamenting all these stories of like, you know, other heroes and legends of mine just basically not quite being able to cut it on the bushwhacking part of the approaches. Oh, I mean, we're like crawling. Like, and we're climbing like, it's like mid 5th class, like jungle. And so like sometimes that's like grass tufts and sometimes it's roots and sometimes it's stalks of bamboo and like little mini cliff bands we're ascending.
Did you bring a machete?
We did not bring a machete. And like in this case, I don't think we really needed it. It's more like what you need is just like to realize that it's actually not that bad. That this also as a kid would have been considered fun. And like you'd be crawling around and making forts in it if you were a kid. But instead we like, as climbers, I feel like we're like, well, we're here to climb. And it's like, well, sometimes you got to get there. And yeah, it's definitely something that we ended up bonding over a lot was our like the fact that we both enjoy somehow like what many consider masochistic like bushwhacking.
Tad and Jim have picked out what looks like a flat spot on the map, hoping to make their first camp there.
And it turns out to be this incredible like infinity pool lake that we stay at and in this beautiful little cirque just under like a rolling glacier. And yeah, we get to bed, you know, after like another couple hours of just like rapping, like telling like he's just telling me all these like awesome stories about all these climbs I've either read about or, you know, wished I was on or somehow like want to recreate or one way or another. And, you know, like all the while it's just funny. You start to just feel more connected and you start to like, I don't know, I guess that's the way I think that mentorship really breaks down barriers. Things that feel like they could be hard to access or hard to introduce oneself to. As you build a relationship with someone, you build comfort with the person, you also, I feel like, build comfort with like those experiences as though like, oh, I could see myself doing that or why not? I didn't care if anyone ever knew we climbed this stuff. It felt like a romantic way of adventuring, like actually just doing it to like have this shared experience. And like some of it maybe felt surreal, but it also like didn't at all. It just felt really natural.
In the morning, Tad and Jim cross a creek and they keep trekking forward. They aim for the west ridge, and after a few hundred feet of delicate scrambling, it's time to rope up. Within a few hours, they've gotten within 200 meters of the summit.
We had several instances with condors just like soaring over us, circling. And like Jim loves the condors. He's always like, what do you think? Should I play dead? Like see if they'll try to eat me?
With a few more pitches, they soon reach the summit. From there, they can see for miles. It's all glaciers and jagged peaks as far as the eye can see.
Turns to me, he's like, how does it feel to be like the first person to like be somewhere? And I was like, oh, I mean, if that's true, like it feels pretty cool. But I wasn't like totally sold yet.
They spot what appears to be an easier way to scramble off the other side of the peak.
And then I come across a cairn, and I was just like, fuck, I knew it. Like someone had been here, I knew it. And Jim kind of can't believe it. Yeah, we like made it back to our camp after having done this like new route on a peak that had been climbed once before. But yeah, I mean, the adventure wasn't over because we had decided that wasn't really enough for us.
Instead of just retracing their steps, Jim and Tad pick up their cache pack rafts and head for the river.
So our idea was when we finish the climb, we'll go down to our pack rafts, blow them up, get into the Rio Colonia, go for about 8 or 10 miles into the Baca, and then go down the Baca River, which flows really fast, to a point where we get out, and my wife, Angela, picks us up with the truck. That was the plan.
And, neither of us were like epic boaters, but in the spirit of adventure, we're having a pretty good time. And we have a couple little cool rapids and little like chutes that we get to kind of go through on the way down. And I remember at one point scouting one, and Jim's like, is it good? I'm like, yeah, it's pretty good. And he just goes. Like, he didn't like even like question it. We end up like staying the night on this like amazing like sandbar, basically this little island in the river, and which, looking back, maybe wasn't the best idea, but like we were psyched.
Overnight, the water level of the river rises substantially, and by the time they wake up, they're mere inches above the river. It's a close call, but soon enough, they're back in the rafts heading downstream. They know they have a few bigger rapids and portages to navigate that day on their way out to the pullout, so Tad pulls out his camera to look at the photo of the map.
Sure enough, I start to be able to see the rapids. I'm like going to put my camera away again. I could like put it in a waterproof bag and like kind of secure it to the boat, and then I could take it out, put it around my neck, like look at it, put it back in the boat. And I go to put my camera away, and my hands, I'm not paddling, my hands on my paddle, but pretty relaxed in the boat. And one of these little whirlpools that like big boiling, churning rivers will produce just like kind of sweeps me in. And I didn't have control of the boat. I'm scrambling with my camera. I'm scrambling, trying to like paddle, but trying to put my camera away because I don't know what's going to happen. And then I start back paddling hard, and then it twists me around, and I start trying to paddle out of it. And eventually I'm paddling backwards again, trying to get out of the whirlpool, and I get out of it, and then I just flipped right over.
And I'm a little bit in front of Tad, and I heard this, oops, the noise, and look back. He's in the river holding on to the pack raft.
A lot of like those pack rafts, the early pack rafts didn't have these big like buoyant sterns, and so there was a risk of like flipping backwards at times, and I proved it correct. And I flip in, and I just remember Jim, as I'm like trying to gain control of the boat, just being like, "Oh, what's going on up there? Like what are you doing? What's going on?" And I just like flip in the boat, like my shoes like weren't on, so my shoes are floating. I have like a sleeping pad floating. My camera's like around my neck, and I keep hold of the boat. I somehow like, it's cold. I get back on the boat, get back in, and I'm like pretty worried that one of these is going to take Jim in too.
Jim makes it around the whirlpools unscathed, but
my camera's broken. I can't get my camera to turn on. And that was our map. And so we don't really know where we are anymore.
Without a map, it's going to be pretty hard to find their takeout point. But as a backup, they'd written down some GPS coordinates that they could plug into their satellite tracking device.
I mean, I can even remember Angela saying, "Oh, here are the coordinates, but I haven't converted them yet." And like, I heard that, but Jim was the one writing them down, or at least the one like taking them. And I didn't think about converting them anymore. And whether Jim heard or not, I don't know, but neither of us converted the coordinates. And so as we try to figure out where we are, we realize later that, oh, we don't even fucking have a clue because we don't even have the right numbers to deal with.
a note for all you very technical people. GPS coordinates can be written in a few different formats: degrees, minutes, seconds, degree, decimal minutes, decimal degrees, etc. And having the wrong coordinate format, well, that makes your information totally useless.
And so we were by memory trying to like remember like how many bends or how many cascades we were supposed to pass before finding this pullout. And so like all of a sudden, like we start to talk ourselves into believing that we know where we are. We weren't that far off, but we miss our turn, basically. We miss our pullout. And that was the last time the road comes in contact with the Rio Bacher for like 70 kilometers.
Jim and Tad need to find that road. Without cell phones, how would Angela have any idea where to pick them up?
And that part of the river is gnarly. Like, and I don't even know if you can portage all of it. We hadn't looked into that part. But we looked into it enough to know that we shouldn't be there. And Jim is also, at this point, I remember him like throwing his hands up in the air and like putting his head in his hand, just like, oh, like Angela. And just like so worried about our like irresponsibility and like missing the pullout. I mean, at that point, I'd also told Angela like on the inReach, okay, like, you know, before I went in the water, we should be there in like 3 hours or something. And at that point, we're not sure if we're going to run into her that evening at all.
Tad and Jim aren't sure if they've already passed the pullout or if they haven't even reached it yet. But the river is getting bigger and bigger, and they know they need to get off of it.
I'm like laughing because like, look at what we've done. Like now we're having a real adventure. And Jim's like alternating between like laughing and being like, we are fucked. And then all of a sudden we see this estancia, like there's a smokestack and there's like another estancia and there's clearly someone there. It's smoking.
They pull their pack rafts ashore. Neither Jim nor Tad speaks great Spanish at this point, so they struggle to ask the farmer if he knows where the road is. The farmer then points to the estancia on the other side of the river, and so the two ferry their pack rafts across, and they find a man who speaks English.
And it turns out they've built a new road in the last like year that goes to where we passed and the campsite that we're actually supposed to meet Angela at. And so we're learning all this information and getting very excited. And they happen to have a truck that we can load the pack rafts on even and just start driving.
They hop in the truck and drive towards the campsite where, miraculously, Angela is waiting in the truck.
And so all of a sudden, like every adventure, it comes to an end.
And it was sort of an epic.
I mean, those kind of experiences help to build bonds too. Like, you know, I've read somewhere recently that, you know, our memory is hugely impacted by dopamine, right? So like when we have these like really exciting or really impactful experiences, they help us create better memories. And I think when it comes down to it, it's really fun to have these adventures, but if we don't take the time to enjoy them and share them with someone else, then they kind of have like a shorter like half-life maybe. Like we forget them more easily. Whereas if we really take the time to like be present when we're in them and then take the time to soak in and evaluate the experience after, that they can be hugely impactful and stay with us like forever and create these epic shared experiences and bonds.
I've been lucky over my 55 years of alpine climbing. I've found some really good partners, and but I can count the partners that I've done in alpine climbing with on the fingers of my hands. Only about 10 or 12 over 50 years. So that tells you something. If you find a good partner, you stick with them.
Tad went back to Chile with Jim in early 2018 to climb Cerro Chueco, the peak that they had originally planned to climb on that last trip, before they got distracted by Puño Este. But in the years since, they haven't actually climbed together much. Plans, work, a global pandemic, it kept them from roping up a lot, despite meeting up occasionally in the States.
In the last 6 years, Tad's been able to bring that skill set he developed in Patagonia to the greater ranges. It's been a massive period of growth. But for Jim, the trajectory has been the opposite.
Now, of course, I got into the age now where I turned 80 last summer. And, you know, I'm still climbing at a level that I think is okay for me. Did I tell you I got Parkinson's disease?
No, I didn't know that.
Well, about 3 years ago, I started noticing some symptoms. I started having trouble with my balance and walking, hiking. Some days I'd be fine. Other days I'd just be clumsy and I'd be stumbling and what's going on? But being a typical male, I didn't go to the doctors. I just said, oh, I'll just work through this. But it got worse and worse. And I had trouble writing my name in cursive and tying my shoes. I had my little motor skills. But I never had hand tremors. And people think of Parkinson's when your hands have tremors, and I never got that. Well, I finally went to a clinic, and after a number of tests, they diagnosed me with Parkinson's. And I thought, okay, great, I got a diagnosis. With the diagnosis comes the treatment. So I started taking a drug called dopamine, and it made an incredible difference. Within 2 days, I had no trouble writing my name, tying my shoes.
Jim's been taking dopamine for over a year now, and he's feeling better.
So much so that at the time this episode airs, Jim and Tad are actually in Pakistan together. A few other friends are joining them, and while Jim isn't planning on roping up, he's stoked to join the guys at base camp. That in itself is quite the trek, and it's not one he was sure he would be able to do again.
We'll see what happens, but I'm not going to give up the idea of climbing unclimbed peaks until I'm at a point where I can't make the approach. I'm not there yet.
I went into the climbing relationship with Jim thinking that I would learn a bunch about like climbing and what it takes to be, you know, someone like Jim, or what it takes to get there to that level, or, you know, learn some like secret to alpinism. And yeah, pretty quickly I learned that that's a myth, and that there is no secret. You have to work hard. You got to try a lot of things. You got to put yourself out there, and that's how you get it. You have to learn. And if I could spend time with Jim, someone who'd lived a lot more life than me, and had a lot of like real experiences, whether it's going through divorce, or whether it's losing one's child, or whether it's partners getting massively injured and having to orchestrate or coordinate rescues. Just like life experience. It's just like you can't fake it, right? You got to go through it. Otherwise, you're just an observer. And I think what Jim really did for me is kind of make some of these more uncomfortable topics or things we often avoid in life, make them just feel real and normal, and like, oh yeah, this guy who I look up to has been through stuff too. You'll hear people say that, you know, if you don't challenge your confirmation biases, you get dumber. If you just only hang out with friends of yours that agree with you all the time, you're not gonna learn as much. But I think one thing that's really cool about intergenerational friendships is that it's kind of built into the foundation is this fact that you're from different generations and you've seen a different world and you have different experiences. I think that's kind of the mark of a good partnership, is that in the end you don't just like someone because you climb well with them, but because you like them as a person.
Ted, have you ever heard this expression, never meet your heroes?
I mean, I think it's a good saying, but that it's an incorrect conclusion. Like, it shouldn't be that you never get to know your heroes, but one should be pretty open to the fact that once you get to know them, they might not seem as heroic. They might feel a lot more just like people. And I think that's really cool. Like, I think that's maybe even cooler.
Thank you, Tad and Jim, for sharing your stories. I hope you're kicking ass in Pakistan right now. Our stories come from friends of friends, and from you, our community. If you have a compelling idea for a guest or a story lead, please give us a shout. You can use the submission form on our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. Thanks to the folks who have recently become Diaries Plus members. It's incredible. Music today from Harris, Freef, Serene Sloth, The Freelance Economy, David Swenson, Tigers in the Sky, and Brendan O'Connell. The tracks are courtesy of the Artists or Track Club. Jacob Bain and Nis Koto composed our theme song. You can find links to the artists at our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. This episode was produced by Lauren Delani Miller and me, Fitz Cahal, with additional production help from Becca Cahal. Illustration by Walker Cahal. Becca Cahal is our producer. I'm Fitz, and you've been listening to the Dirtbag Diaries. Thanks for tuning in.